Let me start by saying welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name's Steve Aligresza. I'm the Executive Director at IHFRA. I know it is the Monday of market, and everyone's really excited for the week ahead. And as we get a little closer, we also believe that this is probably one of the most important conversations that we can have leading up to market. As you know, new tariffs on imported furniture officially took effect on October 14th, impacting upholstered goods and kitchen and bath vanities and wood products as well. More policy changes are coming, including a proposed 100% tariff on Chinese goods that could be reshaping pricing, sourcing, and retail strategy for the short and long term. So we have a very simple goal today, is really because there's so much in the news cycle, so much noise out there, is just to cut through that, focus on the facts, and provide some clarity and confidence that you need to walk into market prepared. So whether you're a rep, manufacturer, retailer, industry partner, my hope is that this conversation will help you be market prepared. So it's my pleasure today to welcome our guest, Chris Andresen, who is partner at Dutko GR. Chris is one of Washington's most respected voices on trade and policy. He spent his career helping industries like ours navigate the intersection of business and government, advising Fortune 500 companies, manufacturers, trade associations on legislative strategy and the real world impact of policy decisions. So Chris, we are incredibly grateful to have you with us today. We appreciate your time. And if we could, I'd love to just kind of start with the big picture, kind of fill us in on the basics. So what's happening, what's included in this latest round of tariffs, what products, what categories are impacted, and how do these new tariffs differ from the reciprocal tariffs that we've seen before?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to all the IHFRA members that have joined today. I've been working with the furniture industry for, call it 15 years or so on federal policy, all kinds of different things. Obviously, been focused on trade recently. So I appreciate the role that IHFRA and your members play in that ecosystem. To the question about what we're seeing specifically as it relates to this latest round of tariffs. And again, now we have different tariff classes, right, Steve? Based on where we are, and I'm sure we'll get to it throughout the course of the conversation here, but that's certainly a major difference we've seen from Trump 1.0 to Trump 2.0. But recently, the Department of Commerce completed a Section 232 investigation. So Section 232 stems from previously passed legislation that gives the department authority over investigations related to imports and products with a national security consideration. And so earlier this year, the president directed the Department of Commerce to start this investigation. And once that happens, the department essentially has 270 days to make their recommendations, finish their report, and then send those to the president. And then ultimately, the president makes the determination around what the rates will be. This is the same process that steel and aluminum tariffs have been implemented, copper, and there's ongoing investigations, including pharmaceuticals, and other AI related. There's things related to metal and different investigations that are ongoing. So this is one of those trade tools that the Trump administration previously, certainly, and then now currently is using very frequently when looking at trade policy and tariffs specifically. Part of that, Steve, is that this is a process whereby the president initiates the investigation, Department of Commerce runs that investigation. There are opportunities throughout the process for the public, any stakeholder, be they company, individual citizen, et cetera, to comment on on this investigation. And certainly when it comes to this particular piece, and you may be thinking, well, how does upholstered furniture and kitchen cabinets factor into our national security, right? You probably equate something different when you think about national security with some of these home goods, consumer goods. Part of the connection that this administration has made in these investigations previously, and certainly one that they made in this one, because this investigation at a high level was focused on timber and lumber imports in the United States. And then upholstered furniture and other products were identified as derivative products, right? Um, the connection was made between uh, the the growth of timber and lumber imports in the United States, weakening the domestic timber industry, thereby weakening the domestic economy, which then creates and reduces our national security. By weakening our economy, we're reducing our national security. That's essentially the argument that the administration, through the Department of Commerce and the president, has made in imposing these new tariffs on specific classes of products. And that's an important piece, Steve, here is um, the resulting investigation and the proclamation and the decision from the president, based on the findings from the investigation, were to impose specific tariffs on product classes. So one, softwood, timber and lumber imports. Then you've got the completed kitchen cabinets and vanities that you mentioned, and then you've got upholstered wooden furniture. Those are sort of the three or four classes. So it's product and sort of HTS code specific. The big difference between that and the reciprocal tariffs you mentioned, that's done under a separate authority that the president has. Again, these are authorities that Congress has legislated and given to the executive branch. Um, those reciprocal tariffs are country specific, right? So they don't look at the actual product. They look at the origin, right? Or the country by which that product is imported from. These tariffs are product and category specific. And so one of the things I'm sure that they've gone into effect now. They've been in effect for about a week. But as you're working with your vendor partners, retail partners within your respective businesses and product categories, one thing you'll pay attention to, obviously, are those HTS codes that are covered by this proclamation. And those are, included in I think some of the materials that are out there. Obviously, that's run through customs. I will say one of the interesting parts of this, when you start looking at some of these HTS codes and how the importation process works, um, they have very specific titles like other, right? And so what I learned again as you're seeing these things come out was that in some cases, um, in some of the cabinet HTS codes specifically, there was a code in there that was listed as other that was capturing previously some case goods, right? Some other sort of, I've heard about wooden occasional tables, entertainment centers that through this, and so that was sort of interesting, thinking about a timber and lumber investigation. I think the obvious connection was to look at case goods. Um, so far, and we can get to the so far part, um, that the connection to case goods and a case goods specific tariff um, does not appear to be the focus or the outcome of this investigation, but there was some potentially um, some products captured in one of those HTS codes that was listed. However, and again, this is why some of these processes are interesting. What this presidential proclamation did was it created sort of a new HTS code for those other products that were not kitchen cabinets and vanities. Part of the key differentiator there is for cabinets and vanities, it's permanent. There's permanent installation as like a qualifier. Obviously, those products don't. Those occasional tables and things we're talking about don't have that same element. So through this process, the administration and then working with customs created a new sort of HTS code that's not subject to these Section 232 duties that would then catch some of those unintended products that were being listed in those other codes. Um, all of this, I like to say, Steve, is confusing by design, right?
Hmm.
You've got a number, and again, you all work in this industry more than I do. These are primarily small, generational, family-owned business, certainly on the retail side, a lot in the manufacturing too. Um, there are some that may be better equipped to handle this, but I worry about the effect to smaller, smaller manufacturers, smaller retailers, thinking about all these different, and this is just one piece. This is just one tariff class. This is not even getting to the reciprocal piece that covers all those different countries with separate rates. So that's sort of where we've been, Steve, over the last few weeks. One thing that was interesting over the summer, of course, I think we all probably remember when the president made a social media post about, an investigation into furniture. He didn't qualify what that was, just mentioned furniture. At the time, you got a lot of outreach about, oh my, is this something new? What is the administration looking at here? That was in connection to this specific investigation. But then it was interesting to see the sort of how that morphed from that initial social media post about furniture, just sort of generally, right, to a more specific focus on upholstered furniture. Like I said, less so on case goods, but then also, again, offering some transparency to the president's thinking about upholstered furniture, making that connection to North Carolina specifically, right? We heard that throughout the campaign, and then we've seen it in action now. And so there was sort of I think a kind of a focal shift from this idea of furniture generally, more specifically looking at upholstered furniture when it came to the process and the practicality of implementing these tariffs. We can talk about that, I think, throughout this, Steve, as we've had some of those conversations and kind of what's ahead. But that's where we are now. And then again, importantly, these Section 232 tariffs are product and category specific. They are not country specific. On that note, though, on the country piece, these tariffs apply to all countries except for the EU, the UK, and Japan. Right? Those three. This is an important point because this is sort of an interesting element of this specific investigation and sort of the resulting proclamation. Um, those three trading partners have negotiated specific language in their trade agreements that have been finalized that essentially cap any, current at the time or future 232 investigation at specific rates, right? So upholstered furniture being imported to the US from the UK is only subject not to 25% or 30% starting January 1st, but to 10%, right? And that's in their trade agreement. The EU and Japan are capped at 15%. As part of the announcement and the decision making here, and I hadn't quite seen this before, but on this one in particular, there was a sort of a reference from the administration to trading partners to say we are open to negotiate alternative rates as we're continuing to negotiate these trade deals. So that's important to remember for, countries like Vietnam, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, some important trading partners in this supply chain, but those are also trading partners that are actively negotiating with the administration on a trade deal. In some cases like India and Vietnam, they have frameworks in place, but they don't have the actual the actual language set. And so you can look to the precedent set by some of those other trading partners, but then the specific call to say, if you want to help us address some of these issues with timber and lumber imports, then we can negotiate a separate rate. So again, that's sort of forward-looking, Steve, right? That none of that has happened yet. It's possible it can happen. But again, beginning October 14th, as you all know, those specific codes, 25% for upholstered furniture, which would increase to 30% starting January 1st.
Right. And just to, again, no need to beat a dead horse here, but as you mentioned, one of the questions here that we get all the time is, do we know if they're going to stack? Do we know how they're going to layer on existing duties? And so is it fair to say, based on the conversation we've had so far, that all of the emergency order, the IEEPA emergency order, reciprocal tariffs, that is just solely based on the country of origin? And then these are not country specific, but again, HTS and product or category specific. So the short answer is yes, they do stack, but depending on the country they origin. Is that the short, simple?
I mean,
there's nothing
yeah,
simple
so
about any of this, but
the main thing to remember on stacking is, and we've seen this, I think that the administration has been a little bit inconsistent with this. And again, I'm presuming that that may be part of the reason for some of the delays in these other trade agreements, right? Because you've had the trade conversation, these tariff rates it's not been linear, right? There's been off ramps, pauses, extensions, et cetera, different countries being treated differently. The one for this to note, though, is that, as you said, Steve, generally speaking, these Section 232 upholstered furniture tariffs do not stack with the IEPA reciprocal tariffs that are country specific, except for China, right? So China, and again, that's where I'm saying they're sort of in a different class, right? So I was trying to do just some rough math as it relates to upholstered furniture imported from China, just to think about what that stacking piece looks like. Because again, if you're just taking this in a vacuum, any other countries besides the EU, UK, and Japan, you're looking at a 25% tariff on these products right now. In the case of China, though, you have um, the 25% upholstered furniture. That's 25%. You have the existing 25% Section 301 tariff, which was from Trump 1.0, right? That was from the previous administration. And then you also have the 20% IEPA reciprocal tariff related to the national emergency and fentanyl. So right there on that specific product, that's 70%. And that does stack. Um, there are other product categories, but I don't think in these HTS codes that have like there's a 7.5% tariff on some other wooden products that I don't think is covered here. But just on upholstery, you're looking at 70% from China based on this because they do stack. Um, Now, again, China clearly in a separate situation, right? We're sort of in a holding pattern with them as well, right? They have until November 12th. That's when some of those, everyone will remember, it's basically an embargo, right? Tariff rate was about 150%. There was some de-escalation there. That's when the IEPA tariff was reduced to 20% for a 90-day period of time. That extension lasts until November 12th. Seems like President Trump and his counterpart, Xi Jinping in China, will be meeting soon to discuss some of these things. But in the meantime, right, there has been some escalation, right? And you saw announcements about an additional 100% tariff on goods imported from China and different things. And so obviously that creates more confusion, Steve, and a lot of different considerations. But on this particular point, these upholstered furniture tariffs generally do not stack. They will be standalone, except for China.
okay. And you kind of just touched on an interesting point that I wanted to bring up next. In your opinion, from the administration's perspective, like what is the goal here of these? Or is it we want to strengthen the U.S. economy, national security, or we want to reshore jobs? Is it the trade imbalance that we heard about a lot earlier this year, or is it a bargaining chip? Like, is it something that is meant to apply pressure, or is there another long-term objective that is yet to be mentioned?
Yeah, I think it's sort of yes and Steve to all of those
Ah,
things, right? And I think it's much more comprehensive in nature during Trump 2.0, 10 months in, than we saw during Trump 1.0. Trump 1.0, and I think this industry is a perfect example, the focus ultimately was on China, right? The Section 301 tariffs um, only applied to China. They obviously those went into effect, and the idea was get out of China. That accelerated a lot of movement from China to other countries in Southeast Asia, as we know, right? Vietnam, Malaysia, India. We talked about that. And again, I think that our industry specifically had much stronger muscle memory related to that, given some of the previous rulings on anti-dumping and wooden bedroom furniture from China and some other elements. But you saw a considerable migration from China on the manufacturing side for a lot of different industries, right? I was in meetings with, the apparel industry, all kinds of other connected industries that had been in China predominantly that were moving to Vietnam. We saw what that looked like. That seemed to be the goal in Trump 1.0. And then you mentioned trade imbalances, right? You think about what was happening at the end of the first Trump administration. They had a Section 301 investigation open on Vietnam related to illegal logging and currency manipulation. Um, they were essentially looking at our trade deficits. Obviously, China was the biggest, and going down and sort of initiating some of those investigations. That was sort of their metric. Then, of course, they lost the 2020 election, and so that was sort of interrupted, right? And those investigations from the Biden during the Biden years didn't expire. They just weren't ever concluded. Um, so in that intervening 4 years, um, there's a much more sort of specific and deliberate trade policy plan in place. And that's what we're seeing play out now, right? You mentioned IEPA, that was the authority. So when you think back to those first days of the administration, all those executive orders, one of the ones was to declare a national emergency on the borders of our nation around fentanyl. Well, that became the basis for the IEPA and reciprocal tariffs because the statute, allows for the president to have that authority if there is a national emergency. So they declared that emergency. Um, this time around, though, Steve, I think there's a much different endpoint, which is if you have such a broad tariff strategy, right? Not just Section 301 in China, not just focusing there, but on every trading partner. Um, that's trying to make the economic case for industries to come back to the United States, right? And so I think that's something that our specific industry has been wrestling with, right? And it's coming at a time, and we've all seen all the different announcements with investments from different industries coming in. Um, you all know the amount of business that got pulled forward during COVID for this industry, hugely impactful for the national, the U.S. economy during that time, right? Very, very destabilized on the economic front, business pulled forward. But we've had, as you all know, flat to down years the last couple of years. Um, and so coming to an industry like ours, fragmented on the retail side, small, predominantly, small businesses to drive through some of these investments to bring industries back. Um, it's not a short-term possibility, right? This is a longer term um, a longer term goal for our industry, right? And so that's what, Steve, I know that you were here earlier this year on a joint fly-in with other industry partners. We were talking to a lot of members of Congress and the administration about the short-term pain and about tariffs and these trade policies. But we were asking, what is the strategy? What is the end goal? If we can understand that, then we can maybe figure something out, and how to work. Businesses, obviously, you guys work with these businesses, they're flexible, they're agile. But trying to determine your business strategy based on a headline or a social media post that could change on a finite period of time, typically short, is really difficult. And so this idea of bringing industries back, that is the goal now. And there's three planks, right, to the administration's economic vision. A is tax reform. So that was the big beautiful bill that was signed in July. That sets the permanent tax reform rates. Then you've got tariffs, right? So you want a more definite and permanent taxing element that businesses care a lot about. You want trade policy that promotes this reinvestment. And then third thing, deregulation. Obviously, the furniture is one of the most heavily regulated products on the market. And so looking at reducing some of those regulatory burdens, those are still in existence for a lot of, furniture manufacturing processes and things. Um, so our message to the administration has been, let's look at places where there is still a strong domestic element in this industry. Um, and quite frankly, I think that is upholstery, right? And that's why the president was thinking about, North Carolina and upholstered furniture, obviously left out other places like Mississippi, right? Where we've seen that be stable as well. But if you think about case goods and wood furniture, um, the upside to wood and case goods returning to the United States seems rather limited, right? And so the point being, you know, placing a tariff on those products doesn't really give you the upside for that industry coming back. But tariffs typically have been protectionist in nature. So if you have an industry like upholstery with at least a decent domestic presence, also understanding that there are some imported materials and parts related to that too, that support those domestic jobs. And that's one of the things we've talked about as an industry, how some of these imported materials and components do then support the domestic jobs. Um, how do you develop and think about a trade policy that helps a domestic industry but doesn't inflict so much price, affordability concerns that you're really shutting things down? And so that's something that we've been in continuous conversations with the administration about, um, understanding now that their goal line has shifted from get out of China and diversify to come back to the United States. And so we have to be, I think I use the royal we collectively, IFRA members, furniture manufacturers, retailers, we have to be realistic with them, with the administration about what that looks like for our industry. It's going to be different for automobiles and different for AI and pharmaceuticals and things. But so we have to talk about what's the furniture story here. And knowing that this has been an area that the president is at least interested in, trying to get that story within the administration to help them understand, okay, if we're looking at these specific policies, how will that affect the furniture industry today, their consumer? But then what does that look like in 6 months, in 12 months, in 5 years, right? And so those are much different conversations that we had during Trump 1.0, where it was no tariffs. I was involved in a bunch of coalitions, was like, tariffs are really bad, no tariffs. That message didn't necessarily resonate, right? And it certainly with this administration hasn't resonated either. So it's trying to figure out where can we um, kind of work within that strategic framework to best position our industry to compete in that environment.
Okay. Yeah, so you kind of lead me to my next question, which is, what's next? What do we need to look forward to? But I
Mhm.
just have to stop and pause for one moment. And to everyone on the call, just we are going to leave a little bit of time at the end here for Q&A. So if you guys have questions, feel free to drop in the chat along the way. But I've got to ask, from the administration's perspective, or just based on the policies and the strategies so far, like, I mean, who stands to win from this? The way I see it, IFRA members are struggling. They're commission-based 1099 independent contractors, right? For the most part, manufacturers don't know what to order and how to order based on the tariff. It's a very dynamic and fluid environment there, and retailers are struggling with macroeconomic issues on top of, I'm afraid to order because I don't know when this tariff is going to hit or that tariff is going to hit. But so who is there a winner right now? Because it feels like we're all each segment of the industry has sort of come under fire. Um, Maybe that's
Yeah.
a question for later. We can save that to the Q&A. But uh,
I mean, I think it's difficult to determine what that is now. Obviously, from the administration's perspective, as they're looking at these, and again, as I said, with the tariff and the trade policy piece has not been linear. There's been different fits and starts, and there's been different forecasts about what the effects will be. But now, I mean, going back to April, that was Liberation Day when we had that big chart of all the, country-specific tariffs, and then I don't think they ultimately went into effect until August, right? And so now you've got a couple of months of that, plus now you're layering on some of these additional um, product and category specific tariffs from these other investigations. The administration will definitely take their wins as they see them when it comes to companies investing in the United States, right? Obviously we've seen that with in the auto industry. We've seen a little bit of that in the appliance side with some announced investments from Whirlpool and others. Obviously, there's a lot of planned investments on the AI side. That being said, kind of like on the trade side, those are announcements. They make for great, um, you know, uh, sort of press conferences and press releases. Ultimately, then though, how do those things get put into action? And I think there are some limiting factors, especially with our industry, as it relates to, workforce development and things that are limiting factors. We saw some of this during Trump 1.0 and the Biden years where there was big announcements for certain, whether they're parts of supply chains or industries to come to the United States, and then they never ultimately came into existence, right? And so I think that's where we need to be again upfront and factual about what those limiting factors are for us. But we also know, especially in our industry, and I've talked a lot with just given our industry's reliance on the housing market and how that's been so depressed over the last few years, that's sort of again taken us down. Um, you know, it was interesting in talking to the National Association of Home Builders. They were looking at certain things, and with all these different policies factoring in, they were saying that it costs $12,000 more today to build a house based on some of these policies. That wasn't even factoring in home furnishings, right? I've been talking to them about factoring that in, and so that affordability piece is certainly something that we came back to with the administration to say, you know, at the furniture level, reps, retail, we're very close to the consumer. There's a lot of sensitivity out there. These are discretionary purchases. Housing's down. Um, if you look back to any of those recessions or downturns, typically, furniture is one of those elements that if it's going down, that's a clear indicator about what's coming. And so, um, you know, now it seems a little bit more serious and concrete now, Steve, about what the effects of these tariff policies are going to be. Because over the course of the last 8 months, from Liberation Day to now, there were forecasts, but nothing was actually in place and in effect. And now we're sort of seeing that. And so you start to see inflation tick up here and there. There's little indicators that that leads back to your question of like who is winning, right? Um, and who is this going to benefit? Ultimately, the administration hopes that it benefits those companies that are here and their employees. Um, but those victories aren't going to come in 2 or 3 months. They're going to come in if you can sustain that and build on it over a course of a period of time, 2 or 3 years, right? Um, and so I think the answer to that right now is a little bit less known. I mean, we know, and specific to this investigation, um, like the kitchen cabinet manufacturers, they were pushing aggressively. And that's interestingly, that's one of the areas within the home, like where there is still a pretty strong domestic presence, is on kitchen cabinets. Um, they were pushing for 100% tariff um, on those products. Now, of course, for cabinets and vanities, they're at 25% now, but they will be increasing to 50% starting January 1st. So you can see where some of those domestic industries have kind of leaned into this approach from the administration and try and again have them benefit their industries and their companies in the short, intermediate, and long term.
And sort of shifting towards what's ahead. I know you've kind of alluded to it, but I mean, what should we be bracing for as we look ahead into the tail end of this year, early 2026? You know, what sort of political shifts might we expect to see over the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the most immediate piece is the Supreme Court challenge to the reciprocal and IEPA tariffs, right? And so that is a case that's gone through a couple of lower court rulings, which have actually ruled that those IEPA reciprocal tariffs are unconstitutional. Clearly, one of the legacies from Trump 1.0 is the makeup of the Supreme Court, and I think last I heard, that was a couple weeks ago, that this administration has won like 20 plus cases at the Supreme Court this year alone, right? So, um, I that court case has been described to me as a jump ball, right? Which is essentially this idea that the president has unilateral authority to impose these reciprocal tariffs on all these countries, um, is in fact illegal. That's one thing that's the question that the Supreme Court will be deciding. Obviously, with the potential implications to that, they're hearing that on an expedited schedule starting November 5th. So there should be a ruling on that before the end of the year. Um, but that was also what I was hearing, and I was walking through sort of the Section 232 process before. One of the things that we had heard is, again, based on that court case being a jump ball, um, having some of these other investigations in place with processes with public comment run by the administration, making recommendations, that was potentially a fallback plan, right? To at least have some other tariff mechanisms in place that were potentially on more solid legal ground. So that's one thing to watch over the next, let's just get, weeks and months, right? Is that Supreme Court IEPA case.
Can I quickly interject with the question, a
Yes.
follow up specific to that? Would that be dependent on if the shutdown ends, or could they meet regardless?
No, they can meet regardless.
Okay.
So that's still, as far as I know, Steve, on the books.
Fair enough.
But and hopefully again you bring them shutdown. Hopefully we can get over that soon. But the other thing as it relates to Section 232, and we've seen this on the steel and aluminum side, actually specific to furniture, is during Trump 1.0 with the Section 301 tariffs, we heard a lot about exclusions and exemptions, right? There where certain industries could apply for an exemption from a tariff based on a lack of domestic supply. Um, we saw some exemptions in place for upholstered seating, for instance, on the Section 301 piece. Um, the Section 232 process has an inclusion process. So the opposite is true, where industries can and stakeholders can petition the government for products to be added to the Section 232 category and product list. So where does this impact furniture? So with the existing steel and aluminum tariffs, um, we have seen already requests for inclusion around all metal furniture, recliner mechanisms, and mattress supports, box springs, things like that related to mattresses. Um, Companies have petitioned the government to add to the steel and aluminum tariffs on those specific products. Um, what happens there is the government opens a 2-week window. They take those petitions, then they publish them and ask for public comment. Comment on those additions ends tomorrow, right? So other affected companies and things can respond to that. But there will be a similar inclusion process as it relates to these timber and lumber tariffs too. And I've already seen a letter from a hardwood association to the president asking for more wood products to be included in the Section 232 piece. So as far as what's ahead, Steve, that's what we're looking at. This process is evergreen, especially on Section 232. And we have an administration that clearly has um, their process, their posture is going to be to be as inclusive as possible potentially. I mean, I will say on the steel and aluminum side, they've already run one inclusion process, and that process they added like 407 categories. It was a really strong hit rate. If you asked for it, it was basically like you got it, right? And so that's certainly something for us to be mindful of as far as what's ahead when it comes to these pieces, because now that obviously if you set the Supreme Court case aside, right, see what happens there. But then you've got these other um, tariff classes in place under different authorities. There are different ways that the administration can potentially impose tariffs outside of the IEPA framework. So, and then as far as Congress goes, and you heard this too when you were here in DC, and it's ongoing, especially from, certain delegations in Congress. There's a lot of sympathy out there for furniture reps, retailers, manufacturers about the effect of these trade and tariff policies on their businesses, their consumers, etc. Is that sympathy matched with any political will to to try and direct the administration to take a different path? I would say no, right? We have not seen that, politically speaking, especially on the Republican side, right? To try and divert some of these tariffs and trade policies. Now, you have heard a growing chorus of, farm state senators and representatives and the effect of these tariff policies on exports and the effect of that industry. And just like in Trump 1.0, because I got asked a lot back then, what's the administration doing with these revenues from tariffs? Um, they're using those to reinvest in farmers and agriculture in the ag sector. We're starting to see some of those same things pop up now. Um, and so I suspect you're going to be seeing and hearing some of that. So the question then becomes for this industry, what does that look like? If things do really start to decline, then that's accelerated based on these policies. What is next? What is our potential remedy for that? And I don't think that there is one readily available there. So, and again, the other thing too, on this specifically, these upholstered furniture and kitchen cabinet tariffs, like I said, there are still trade agreements to be negotiated. There may be alternative rates set. I wouldn't expect them to be that much lower if that does happen, but I would say it definitely makes sense to pay attention to what's happening with some of those other Southeast Asian countries that have continue discussions with the administration to see if those agreements have any effect on these specific Section 232 upholstered furniture tariffs.
Okay. So, Chris, let me ask you this. One, what can the home furnishings industry as a whole, of course, I'm speaking specifically about the reps from that perspective, but um, how does the industry respond? How do we help advocate for a more balanced and thoughtful approach to the trade policy? And then, just as importantly, especially for our members of the association, how do they stay informed? How do they keep up and like the whole point we set up top? How do we cut through the noise? Are there any specific resources that you would encourage them to kind of tune in to or focus in on to just stay in the know, and that way, if there is an opportunity to share their voice, share their position, we can help them do that. But where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important. Every member of Congress is hearing about the effects of these tariffs, right? And so I think bringing the furniture rep, and and I was talking to you about this too. There does probably need to be a little bit of education as far as how the furniture industry does operate in this way. I think generally, right, members and their staffs are going to be familiar with manufacturing and retail, right? But then um, giving some education about the role of the rep and how that does help those other sides of the industry become more successful is important. So that education piece to define the role of the rep and how this is affecting you and your clients is important. And I think a great like baseline for that conversation. But as I said, these members of Congress they want to hear and they need to hear stories and impacts on certain industries. And I would say, furniture is up there. And because it's something that the president seems to be kind of personally interested in, um, it's one of those areas where then you can start making some of those inroads from the congressional side if they can start talking to the administration about, hey, this is what I'm hearing from you know, furniture reps in my district, in my state. What can we do moving forward to help mitigate some of the effects of these tariffs and these policies? Um, those are conversations worth having. And talking to members of Congress up here, they're open to those ideas and suggestions. Whether or not they're realistic is probably a topic for another webinar to talk through what that looks like. But if they're not hearing those stories from their constituents, then they don't have any plank to then go talk to the administration. And I would say it's not just, the president, although there is obviously a big focus there. He does his cabinet level officials, whether it's Lutnick at Commerce or Besson at Treasury or, Jamison Greer at United States Trade Rep Office, they are frequently engaged with congressional Republicans, right? Especially on Capitol Hill. And so you never know when that particular member may have the opportunity to engage with those officials um, at an event or at a hearing or a meeting. I've been up on the Hill before where, Jamison Greer, the trade rep, has been, meeting with all the, Ways and Means Committee members, right? That's the committee that has jurisdiction over trade. So those types of conversations are happening with Congress and the administration. But I think, we've been working over the last several months, obviously, to really sort of push that furniture specific lens. And again, it's not gonna, it may not, I mean, ultimately it will matter to every member because they're going to have a retail presence. Obviously, the manufacturing side may be a different story that may be more concentrated. But I think on the rep side too, you're going to have some of that geographic diversity that can be helpful in spreading a broader message and just sort of raising the awareness of what is happening on the ground, what are the effects of these policies, what you're seeing from your vendors. Because we've also heard from the administration, like, You see studies like the consumer confidence level and those sorts of things. They're not that interested in those such things. They are interested in some of the more, the hard data, whether that's pricing, demand, imports, whatever that may be, volume. That's where we've gotten some better traction with them. And then, of course, in this industry too, I mean, I've been in the administration talking to them with manufacturers who are, 90+% domestic, who are still saying this, these tariff policies are going to impact my business because I can't get, at scale, I can't satisfy all of the demand with domestically sourced materials. I try my best, but there are certain elements that ultimately, and that's just sort of one example. If you multiply that by the magnitude of the entire industry and the scale of this industry in the US, that's what then helps them realize what we're thinking about. I would say initially, again, when we first started with the administration, their view was that we were only concerned about the China specific pieces to all this. There was less of a understanding and knowledge about the effect more broadly in like Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and other places. So I think that can all help in building that case as they're thinking about this, moving forward. But without making that assumption that the administration knows exactly how this supply chain works and how this industry works. They don't, and I think the furniture rep can be a great example of kind of tying that all together.
Okay. And Chris, thank you. You've shared so much incredible information with us today. It's certainly given me a little bit of clarity, maybe a little bit more confusion too, right? Like
Then I've done my job.
That's right. Yeah. But I do want to leave time for a little bit of Q&A. I did have a couple of questions already come in. I do want to remind everybody, if you have a question for Chris or feel like there's something that you were hoping to get answered today, but we haven't quite covered yet, just feel free to drop it in the chat so Chris can see it, so we can see it. And then I'm going to just quickly jump in with the two that already dropped in here. How will the upholstery tariffs at 25%, or will they impact the USMCA agreements with Canada and Mexico?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have gotten more questions about Canada and Mexico as it relates to the reciprocal tariffs, I think, than I think I was expecting. Because even though those tariffs, and again, it's an important consideration because even though the Section 232 tariffs don't stack on those IEPA tariffs from Canada and Mexico, they still will be in effect, right, for Canada and Mexico, and are in effect. And concurrently, there's an ongoing USMCA review of that agreement that the US has just initiated here internally. So that's also open for public comment. One of the interesting elements about the IEPA tariffs is that there are exemptions in there for USMCA compliant goods. That exemption does not exist when it comes to Section 232, right? So that's one important qualifier there. I think that this obviously the president, and the Canadian Prime Minister was just here, and they were together in the Oval Office and answering some questions. I mean, the president believes that obviously you've got USMCA as kind of the framework. They're going to go through a process to look at what that agreement looks like, but I think there's an opportunity for, I don't even know what to call them, like smaller scale or separate sort of agreements along the way. I mean, that's what the administration has sort of set up. And, back to one of your earlier questions, Steve, about these tariffs being bargaining chips in negotiation. I think this administration views a lot of this as everything's up for negotiation. So, if this becomes an issue for Canada and Mexico, a pain point on the upholstered side, then they're going to have to be willing to offer something up, right, to the administration to come in with a separate or alternative rate as it relates to those specific products. One thing to note though on that timing, like the USMCA agreement, I believe runs through maybe like with some point of 2026. So we've got some time still left in an overall framework, but that would not stop the administration and their counterparts in Canada and Mexico and setting an alternative rate as it relates to this. I just wonder if, you know, given the broader framework around USMCA, that might be more difficult to do in the interim, but it's definitely an option.
Okay. Let's see. We had one come in and says, what do you think the administration's position is on establishing trade agreements with countries beyond the EU, UK, and that could impose lower tariffs and help diversify U.S. furniture sourcing away from Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I think what I heard about the EU deal was like that was the best. That was the best anybody can get, right? Um, so that caps Section 232 at 15%. I think ultimately it comes down to let's just a country in Southeast Asia what they have and are willing to offer when it comes to those negotiations. I mean, some of the things you've seen recently from say Vietnam, they were going to be imposing, investigation or tariffs on like illegally sourced wood from China. Like that's in direct reaction to some of the rhetoric coming out from the administration as it relates to other countries dealing with China. So I view that positively, right? And so I think from the Vietnamese side, we heard all along that like Vietnam was one of the first countries in to talk about the trading relationship and the impact of these reciprocal tariffs. So I think that in a country like that, they're going to be building a case for making a broader deal or a specific deal as it relates to a number of different things. I think it's important for us to make sure that our industry, the furniture industry, is high on their list so that they understand like I didn't know that we would see this in my lifetime, that Vietnam would overtake China as far as, number one exports on the furniture side. So I think I think there's certainly an opportunity for that. I think it just depends on what that country has to offer in those discussions with the United States.
Okay, thank you. All right, I've got a few that are kind of specific here. So, will the steel tariff stack on top of the wood upholstery furniture tariff? For example, a dining chair from Malaysia with steel legs, subject to a 25% wood upholstery furniture tariff, but is there also a 50% steel tariff on the steel portion of the chair?
So I'm gonna have to come back on this one, Stevie. But my initial lean on this is that would be yes. And in that, on the steel and aluminum side, one interesting piece there is that Section 232 tariff does allow you to apply the tariff to that portion of the value of the product. So it's not the full chair, right? It's just the steel portion of it. So if the value of the chair is $80, but the value of the steel in it is 15, that's a much different calculation. That would be my understanding as the question was phrased. You would have the 25% upholstery plus the 50% as it relates to the steel portion. But I will get back to you on that one since it's so specific, if I
Sure.
may.
Yeah, and I know we're running out of time, so if you've got a hard stop at one, we'll do our best to send these questions to you.
Okay.
But there was one that said, hey, I work for a factory direct it's blown glass product in China. How is that factory going to be impacted by the new tariff? And my other company makes lamps in Vietnam. How are tariffs affecting them? Is that like boiling down to the HTS code for that one, or
Yeah, essentially. And so I would suspect that these new tariffs, if we call them that, right? The Section 232 tariffs on upholstered furniture, based on what I'm seeing there, would not likely impact those products. Those products, though, would still be subject to the current IEPA tariffs for coming from China and Vietnam based on that. So from what I know from that question, Steve, that would be my response there. Is they wouldn't be subject to these new tariffs, but I think it is an important point to note as you're talking to your vendors and your clients, understanding exactly which HTS codes they're using to import products, because then you can come back and cross-reference that with those specific HTS codes that are listed. That's important to know because, like I said, some folks have been bringing products in under a code that had been covered previously, but that code has now been sort of, I guess, cleaned up, and there's been a new code made for those other products. But I think based on the lamp side and glass, that would not be affected by these upholstered furniture duties.
And a couple of other ones that came in, and I've got one that came to me directly. Will there be government loans available for U.S. companies to build since most manufacturing has been lost in the U.S.?
You know, there may be some potential support with, again, depending on the size of your company with Small Business Administration. But again, we're talking about a significant amount of capital for an industry like this to come back into the United States. So I wouldn't expect for there to be some massive, might be the wrong word, maybe it is, some sort of a massive government program related to that. I mean, it's interesting during the Biden administration, again, there was this focus on semiconductors, right? And the Congress established in a bipartisan way a big sort of loan grant program for those specific companies. And this administration does not love that, hates that program, right? So I don't see there being some sort of a massive government-backed piece related to this reinvestment. I think the administration views their position to be, we've set permanent tax code. That's helpful. We're, setting a trade policy that will advantage your product and your company if you're doing business and creating these products in the United States. And then we're going to be cutting the regulations. That's going to be their down payment on this, as far as I can tell.
Okay. Let's see, a few others that have popped up. Effective dates for payments of tariffs. Is there a website where you can get or input an HTS code to get a tariff rate? And are upholstered components subject to tariff? If so, what rate?
Yeah, so I can on the upholstery components that is they are subject to tariff, and there's also tariffs at the 25%. And then that's captured in some of those HTS codes. So that one's there. Effective dates for payments of the tariffs. I mean, essentially, as it relates to the Section 232 duties on upholstered furniture, those went into effect last Tuesday, October 14th. So you've got, as these products are being imported now through customs, those tariff rates are being captured by CBP already. As far as a website where you can input the HTS codes and get the tariff rates, I would have to
Chris,
get
I did
back to you on that
find
one.
I did find that there. I dropped a link in the chat. I don't know.
Right. I mean, so that's probably just by looking at the link, that's probably like an annex or something that'll show what the codes are for those specific maybe upholstery items.
Yeah, it looks like sorry, it's lumber and timber, the 232 annex.
Yeah, what that will show you, Steve, and again, that's what a lot of us are working off of here. That's sort of a static resource like that was published that says, all right, if you're importing under these HTS codes, your rate will be 25%. Starting January 1st, 2026, that rate will then be 30%. I'm just so there is, yeah, I saw somebody put in the ITC that may be a more interactive resource where you can actually put the code in and it'll tell you what the tariff is. I will say this is moving so quickly. Sometimes these systems aren't, because I remember that one instance I was telling you about where there were certain products that were covered under a code, like the thing went down and you couldn't quite do it. So things are moving quickly. And then I see in there, I'll have to get back to you on the current codes for on the glass.
Sure.
Uh,
And Chris, let me just ask one question, then we'll probably need to let you go since we're already over on time, and I'm sure you've got other meetings and things going on. But since we have kind of a dynamic industry, it's not just the reps, it's retailers, it's manufacturers, it's suppliers, it's everything. But is there kind of that singular message that we could or should be sending to President Trump and the administration to share our concerns? You know, if so, what would just those key points be?
I mean, I would just say that this industry, right, the furniture industry, supports a significant domestic presence on the manufacturing and the retail and the rep, and the in its ecosystem, right? It's a robust domestic industry. There are elements, right, that we can't source from the United States, whether those be finished products or whether those be components to those finished goods. And so we have a global supply chain based on that. But at the same time, we're an important economic driver for the country. And so when you have a healthy furniture business, healthy housing industry, that's typically when you see the economy growing. We haven't seen that the last couple of years, and things have been relatively flat, just overall, and then within our respective industries. And again, helping the administration and policymakers understand the effect of what a tariff actually is. Like, how does that, and I think it's a great way for you all to, because I've been getting all kinds of incoming, surcharges and price adjustments, like how that affects your businesses and clients on a numbers standpoint, right? If you look at what the tariff is, what those surcharges and pricing changes are, but then what does that look like to the consumer, right? Especially at a time with all these other sort of affordability and economic considerations that we have out there. And that we want to get back to a place where we have a healthy housing industry, a healthy furniture industry, so we can continue to grow both of those industries and support, our local, regional, and national economies. I think that's the story, is talking about how this industry has supported domestic jobs, growth, and output over decades. There are elements of the industry that are no longer in the United States. Some we could expect maybe can grow, come back a little bit, others that maybe not. But then how do we ensure that, consumers getting the best price for the, safety, regulation, compliance, all those different elements, is a great place to start.
Chris, thank you. We've actually gone over. We said we were going to keep everyone for an hour today, you included. So I want to thank you again for sharing your time, sharing your expertise, and just giving us the information that we need to go into this market prepared, so we can guide some of the conversations that we will undoubtedly have. So we will be recording, or we obviously recorded this webinar. We'll send out a copy of the webinar. We'll send out some additional resources as soon as they are available. And until then, I again want to say thank you, Chris. Thank you to each of you who made time to come out today. And we will look forward to seeing most of you at High Point Market. But Chris, thank you. I'll give you the last word, sir.
Steve, thanks again. I know it's a busy week. You mentioned High Point Market. I wish I was going down. It's always been an interesting and vibrant experience for me. It's also interesting to note that in some of the president's first comments about the industry, he recalled High Point Market and going down and shopping for his hotels, right? So it's a huge week. I'm sure you'll be having a lot of these discussions on the floor at the at market. And, again, appreciate the partnership here, Steve, and look forward to staying in touch as we deal with these dynamic issues.
Beautiful. Thank you, Chris. And thanks again, everyone, for making time today. And with there, we will say happy selling and safe travels as we get into market. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.